J. Lloyd Eaton was a science fiction fan. He's a doctor in Berkeley. Science fiction was popping in the Bay Area the time he was there. His collection came to UCR in 1969. We bought from him his collection of 8,000 volumes of science fiction. The Eaton collection now holds about 300,000 items. Not that quantitative measures are really relevant to what's great about a science fiction collection. What's great about a science fiction collection in a research library like this one is what research can be done with it. And by any measure, the Eaton's magnificent in terms of the research that can be done here. And that's both breadth and depth. This is the oldest book in our collection. It is Utopia by Sir Thomas More. More was a churchman. He disagreed with Henry VIII about who was head of the English church and was beheaded by Henry VIII in 1535. Before that, he wrote the book Utopia, which gave us the word utopia. Utopia is actually a pun. It means nowhere or no place. But since his book, it has come to mean either the perfect society or the ideal society. More really was writing just about a better society. In More's Utopia, things are, again, not perfect, but better than they are in the world he saw around them. This is not the first book about a better society, but this is the one that is considered foundational for utopian narrative. Utopia has been very influential in speculative fiction. There's another genre that's big in science fiction called dystopia, which is a worse society than the one we live in. So Utopia really founded two major genres for us. Now we're going to jump forward 80 years to 1596. It's the English Renaissance. Elizabeth I has been on the throne since 1558. In 1588, she defeated Philip of Spain's Spanish Armada, and English culture is flourishing. Edmund Spenser was a poet who really wanted to catch Elizabeth's eye. So he wrote a six-book poem called The Faerie Queene. It's one of the great English language epic poems. What it does is it follows the adventures of 6 different knights, each of whom learns to exemplify a particular virtue. It's not just a knightly adventure. You don't just see the knight running around killing dragons and being perfect. You see the knight learn to be virtuous. Spenser had an educational idea in mind. He wanted this book to be a lovely, decorative, pleasant to read, poetic part of the education of the Christian gentleman. One of the reasons why this book is important for science fiction and fantasy is that it imagines a world not as it is, but as the author would like it to be, and also because that world is fairyland. So you look over the genre of modern fantasy, vast swaths of it take place in a somewhat imaginary European Middle Ages where there's magic. There are some works of science fiction and fantasy that directly reference or draw on the Faerie Queene, but the Faerie Queene got that genre of imaginative fiction off to a roaring kind of start. Frankenstein, when it was published in 1818, was the 3-volume 19th century novel. It was written by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. The story of Frankenstein is that a young doctor, Vincent Frankenstein, decides he wants to create life. And this is at a time when electricity was imperfectly understood, thought to be a subtle fluid that animated every living being. Victor Frankenstein gets a corpse, animates it with electricity, and then runs out on it when it's just opening its eyes because he thinks it's ugly. The creature makes his own way in the world and eventually gets very, very angry at Victor. Comes back to confront him, is rejected again because he's a reanimated corpse. Really, pretty much no one will talk to him. Everyone runs away in fear. He becomes very bitter, very angry, pleads with Victor to make him a mate. Victor says yes, Victor says no, and the creature becomes a monster, and because Victor has created and then ruined the creature's life, murders several people important to Victor. It's a story about science, because what it talked about was pretty much cutting-edge science or cutting-edge speculative science for 1818. The story has endured the idea of a creature created by science and what goes wrong. There were certainly created creatures in myth and legend before 1818, but this is the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning, in a way, of the novel as we recognize it. The first review, or one of the first reviews of Frankenstein, was written by Sir Walter Scott. You'll see that the author's name is not mentioned. Sir Walter Scott assumed that Mary's husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, wrote it. But Scott spends a good part of this review from 1818 trying to enunciate what kind of book this is, because he feels he's never seen it before. So it really was a sensation, and that's why it's considered by some scholars to be the beginning of science fiction, the first work of science fiction. But it's also a Gothic, and as I said, it's also tremendously influential in the genres of fantasy and horror. The story Flatland, first published in 1884, a romance of many dimensions by a square, is the story of a two-dimensional being encountering the third dimension. Imagine that you are a two-dimensional drawing. You live on a page. You can move these ways, and suddenly somebody puts the tip of a pencil on that page. There's another dimension out there. Right? So that's Flatland. It is not the most thrilling read, but for sheer density of ideas, it's marvelous. It's one of the marvelous things that science fiction does, is hand you ideas that make your brain sort of go wang, 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 wang. And in 1984, 100 years after Flatland was published, this edition of Flatland was created. It's not a codex. It's not a book with pages bound to a spine. It's an accordion fold book. So, nominally, you can read Flatland in 2 dimensions. This is the April 1897 of the Cosmopolitan magazine, not our modern Cosmo, in which appeared the first installment of a story by H.G. Wells called The War of the Worlds. It was much loved in proto-science fiction, adventure science fiction, but the impact it had, the biggest impact it had, came in 1938, where on Halloween 1938 there was a radio drama of War of the Worlds in which Orson Welles was involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmer's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught by the woods.
It was so realistic that there was panic across the U.S., thinking that this wasn't a radio drama, this was a live news report of Martians invading Earth. And it spread the idea of other planets, aliens, Martians, far beyond the science fiction readers of 1938. Not that people didn't know that the planet Mars was out there in 1938, not that no one had ever imagined being from other planets, but this put a science fiction scenario in the brains of nearly every American. It reflected the time, because it was 1938, thoughts of war, invasion, conquest were very much in the news. So that's one really strong impact that this work had on the real world, the world that exists outside of speculative fiction. This is May 1950, Astounding Science Fiction, which is one of the great pulps, cost 25 cents. It published the first story of Dianetics, right? A new science of the mind. L. Ron Hubbard started writing science fiction. Dianetics and L. Ron Hubbard's entire worldview, theology, etc., moved away from fiction and, became a church. But this is where it started. So this is a piece that definitely participated in a change in American society, the founding of Dianetics as a religion, or a theology, or whatever you want to call it. Things on that scale haven't happened from science fiction commonly, but this is a big one. This is one that we keep in the vault, because this issue of Astounding is very, very, very sought after by collectors. This is Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the source text for Blade Runner. So this book had a huge impact in bringing ideas of androids, cloning, artificial intelligence to the attention of a whole lot of people in America who weren't particularly science fiction readers. It was not new to talk about androids or artificial intelligence in science fiction in 1968, but when Blade Runner was made, that conversation got a kind of huge imaginative exposure. The story of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is not exactly the story of Blade Runner, but the bones are there. What happens to an android with a shorter lifespan? What if there's an android who doesn't know that they're an android? What is being a person? What is intelligence? What is consciousness? Can consciousness be computational as well as biological? So, The Left Hand of Darkness is a new wave science fiction novel first published by Ursula K. Le Guin in 1969. You can see the progression of styles and also of subject matter, but the main thing the book is about is gender. Right? The people of a particular planet, right, are observed by a traveler who goes there, not unlike Utopia, not unlike the book Utopia, right? They are no gender in particular unless they're reproducing. So this reflected the world. There was lots of talk about gender in 1969. And it also changed the world because gender had been gender had not been used in science fiction in quite this way, at quite Le Guin's depth. One of the famous sentences in this book is about the king being pregnant. So that was the kind of, that was the kind of social construct that Ursula Le Guin, as she so often did in her career, set about to disrupt by the imaginative work in her stories. But you look at this run of novels and you don't see much about gender. What's significant here is what isn't really happening on the book covers. Now, one of our faculty members, the author Nala Hopkinson, is always reminding me that science fiction authors don't have a lot of influence over what goes on the covers of their books. But this tells the story of how science fiction publishing chose to deal with this extremely explosive book in 1969. You know, if you got 200 scientists who read science fiction together and said, so has your reading and the conversation, the speculation, influenced you as a scientist? Their answers would be somewhere between heck yeah and why are you even asking? Mark Glassy is a biologist. He got his biology degree here in 1998. He went on to develop any number of, insights about cancer. One of the things we have on display in a case that's mostly about him rather than about his collection is his dissertation, which is signed to him by Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury was one of the greats of 20th century science fiction. His work was always extremely imaginative about science. One of his great works is The Martian Chronicles, which is a series of connected stories about human colonists on Mars and what they encounter and what they don't encounter. I'm not saying that Mark got any of his ideas from Ray Bradbury, but he's an example of that kind of engagement between the scientific mind and the science fiction appreciating reader. The conversation about ideas, the idea of how you do or don't extrapolate from, current circumstances or technology to what might happen or what might not happen, is a huge part of where science fiction and science come together. Anything that asks tough questions or poses, tough scenarios, hands you situations that really make you think, is important, because not becoming complacent is important. Not losing your imagination is important. To exercise your imaginations, the what ifs, including the what if this thing that is really, really, really important to you isn't essential to who you are. Ursula Le Guin did a lot of that. So did Philip K. Dick. So did the whole new wave of science fiction. But science fiction has always done that. Science fiction, and in their own ways, fantasy, horror, utopian narrative, has always just poked you and say, hey, what about this? Have you thought about this? What if this was so? And there are people who read science fiction for that, for, you know, that what if, that, whoa. There are people who read science fiction, fantasy, horror, utopian narrative for all sorts of other things. But these speculative genres, what's important to them when they ask the hard questions is they don't let us get complacent. They don't let us get stuck. The thing about science fiction is it keeps you working intellectually, analytically, imaginatively. And that's a really important part of being human.